Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a huge challenge, maybe one of the biggest engineering puzzles out there, Northeast Asia. You've got massive power needs, growing fast, heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And yet, there's the COP21 Paris mandate. Net zero by 2050. How on earth do they get there? It sounds almost impossible, right? But we've got a fascinating source today that maps out a path. We're diving into the rising role of PV and wind energy in the power sector and beyond, changing the Northeast Asian power landscape.
And the core message, the really critical takeaway from this study, is pretty striking. It concludes that shifting Northeast Asia to a 100% renewable energy system isn't just some dream. It's actually modeled as being both technically possible and economically the best way forward by 2050.
Economically viable, that's the game changer. And here's something that really jumps out, something for you listening to think about. The study projects the average cost of electricity in this 100% renewable system. It drops to around 55 euros per megawatt hour by 2050. That's significantly lower than today.
Right, and achieving that low cost relies heavily on solar. Solar PV is expected to generate over 70% of the total electricity. Wind power contributes a significant chunk too, about 18%.
Okay, 70% solar. That's a huge number. To make such a bold claim, the methodology behind this study needs to be absolutely solid. Let's unpack how they actually modeled this massive transition.
Absolutely. The researchers used something called the LUT Energy System Transition Modeling Tool. You can think of it as a very complex simulation engine. It essentially uses linear optimization, looking at things like energy demand forecasts, the performance specs of different technologies, how costs are expected to change, and its main goal is always to figure out the least cost way to structure the energy system at each stage of the transition.
And they didn't just look at the big picture annually, did they? The detail seems incredible.
No, not at all. The model operates in hourly resolution, so for every single hour of the year across the entire period from 2015 to 2050, in 5-year steps, it's calculating the optimal mix.
Hourly resolution. That's vital, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with renewables like solar and wind that aren't constant. You need to manage those dips when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing.
Exactly. That level of detail is crucial for figuring out storage needs and grid balancing. And the study also set some pretty firm ground rules, some key constraints. First, big one. After 2015, no building new nuclear power plants, no new coal, no new oil. That forces the model towards cleaner options right from the start. They also put limits on how fast renewables could realistically be built out. You can't just conjure up thousands of gigawatts instantly. So they capped the growth rate, usually around 4% capacity share increase per year. Makes it more grounded in reality. Oh, and gas turbines were allowed, but mainly because they offer flexibility and could potentially run on synthetic natural gas or even biomethane later on, keeping options open without locking in fossil fuels long term.
That makes sense. And something else I found really interesting in the methodology was the prosumer aspect. This wasn't just about giant power plants.
That's right. The model explicitly includes distributed generation. Think rooftop solar panels on homes and businesses, maybe small batteries alongside them. It assumes that the number of people or businesses doing this, generating and consuming their own power, grows steadily, from about 3% back in 2015 up to 20% by 2050.
And that bottom-up element, that distributed generation, must have quite an impact on the overall system needs and costs, right? It's not just passive consumers anymore.
Definitely. It changes demand patterns, reduces grid load in some areas. It's an important piece of the puzzle. Now, regarding geography, they divided Northeast Asia into 13 specific subregions. So you have Mongolia, Japan split into East and West, North and South Korea, and then China broken down into 8 distinct regions. But here's a really critical assumption they made, something we need to keep in mind. Each country was modeled as an energy island.
An energy island, meaning no trading power between countries.
Exactly. No electricity connections across national borders were allowed in the simulation. They did include connections within each country, high voltage lines linking different regions inside China, for example, but no international grid.
Wow, okay. Modeling them as separate islands is a major constraint, especially when you think about sharing resources. That's going to be interesting when we look at costs later. So let's bridge that gap. Let's look at the journey from 2015 to the projected 2050 system. What did things look like at the start?
Well, back in 2015, the region generated about 7,400 terawatt hours of electricity, and it was heavily dominated by fossil fuels. Coal was almost 60%, 58.6% to be exact. Fossil gas added another 14.3%, a huge carbon footprint.
A massive starting point.
Yeah.
And it's not just about replacing that, is it? Demand is going up too.
Way up. The study projects total electricity demand will basically double by 2050, hitting 15,000 terawatt hours. This is driven largely by electrifying transport, electric cars, and more industrial processes running on electricity. But the energy mix, it's completely transformed. By 2050, solar PV is projected at 71.3% and wind at 18.0%. Fossil fuels are virtually gone.
Okay, doubling demand but making it nearly all renewable. The sheer scale of the build-out must be astronomical. What kind of installed capacity are we talking about?
It's enormous. The total installed PV capacity, including both big utility farms and the smaller rooftop systems, reaches 7,400 gigawatts. Just let that sink in. That's nearly 100 times more solar capacity than existed in 2015. Wind power also sees huge growth, reaching 920 gigawatts of installed capacity.
100-fold increase in solar. 7,400 gigawatts. That's mind-boggling. How does that build-out actually happen over time? Is it just a steady ramp-up?
Not quite steady. It's more dynamic. The study shows an interesting pattern. In the earlier phase, say from 2020 up to about 2030, wind power actually leads the charge. Wind installations dominate early on, and wind generation actually peaks around 2030, covering something like 35% of the total demand then. It was just the cheaper, more mature tech at that point.
So wind takes the early lead,
Yeah.
but solar ends up at over 70%. What triggers the big solar boom later on?
It really kicks in after 2035. Solar PV capacity grows throughout the whole period, sure, but it accelerates dramatically after 2035. That's when the costs for PV panels themselves, and just as importantly, the cost for battery storage, fall low enough that solar plus storage becomes the absolute cheapest way to add new generation and balance the grid. So after 2035, you see wind capacity growth basically plateauing, and its overall share starts to drop as solar just takes over everything.
Right, the storage cost is key. A system with 70% solar plus 18% wind is incredibly variable. You absolutely need massive amounts of storage to make it work. Let's talk about that storage component.
Yeah, storage becomes critical. Before 2030, its role is relatively limited, but once you cross that threshold, maybe around 50% variable renewables in the mix, the need for storage just grows and grows. Now, there are different types of storage doing different jobs. You've got diurnal storage, things like lithium-ion batteries or pumped hydro storage. These handle the daily cycles, storing excess solar during the day and releasing it at night. These diurnal systems handle the vast majority of the energy throughput, the actual megawatt hours cycled in and out over the year.
Okay, so batteries and pumped hydro handle the daily balancing act. But what about longer periods, like a week with low wind and sun, or even seasonal variations?
Exactly. That's where seasonal storage comes in, and it's a different beast. The technology here is mainly power to gas. You use excess renewable electricity when it's super abundant and cheap to create hydrogen through electrolysis or even synthesize methane. You store that gas, often underground in salt caverns or depleted gas fields. Now, in terms of sheer capacity, the total volume you can store the seasonal gas storage dwarfs the batteries, but it operates differently. It might only do one full charge-discharge cycle per year, bridging those long gaps, like winter.
Ah, okay. So batteries are for the daily grind, high throughput.
Yeah.
Gas storage is the massive warehouse, huge capacity, used less frequently but for longer durations. That makes sense. Let's pivot to the economics then. We've established this requires, well, unprecedented investment, thousands of gigawatts of new capacity, tons of storage. Yet the headline finding is that the overall cost of electricity goes down from 74 euros per MWh in 2015 to 55 euros in 2050.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? All that new infrastructure. But yes, the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, is projected to fall by about 25%. The reason, according to the study, is that you're eliminating colossal ongoing costs from the old system.
Which costs specifically?
Two main ones. First, fuel costs. No more buying coal, oil, or natural gas year after year. Those costs are just gone in a 100% renewable system. And fuel prices are volatile, remember. Second, CO2 emission costs. Whether it's carbon taxes, cap and trade schemes, or just the societal cost of pollution, those disappear too. When you add those savings together, plus the fact that the actual cost of generating power from new solar and wind keeps falling, it more than offsets the upfront investment in the renewables, the storage, and even the cost of occasionally having to curtail power.
Okay, curtailment. Let's quickly define that for listeners who might not know the term.
Sure. Curtailment is basically when you have too much renewable energy being generated at a particular moment. Maybe it's incredibly sunny and windy and the grid can't use it all and your storage is full. So you have to deliberately reduce the output, essentially wasting potential energy. Building all that capacity means some curtailment is inevitable and its cost gets factored into the LCOE. But the model shows the savings from zero fuel and zero carbon costs are so massive, they easily cover those curtailment costs and still result in a lower overall electricity price.
Fascinating. So the operating savings swamp the capital costs over the system's lifetime. Now, you mentioned earlier those energy islands. Does that impact the cost country by country? Is it 55 euros everywhere?
Oh, definitely not. There's significant regional variation in the LCOE by 2050, and it really highlights the impact of resources and that energy island constraint. The lowest costs are found in China, around 54 euro MWh, and Mongolia, even slightly lower at 53.6 euro MWh. Mongolia has absolutely fantastic solar and wind resources in the Gobi Desert, just world class.
And China.
China benefits massively from its size and its internal grid integration. They can build huge renewable projects in the west and north where the resources are best and ship that cheap power via long-distance HVDC lines to the big demand centers in the east. That averaging effect brings down the national costs.
Okay, so who has the highest costs then?
South Korea stands out with the highest projected LCOE, about 61.9 euro MWH. And the study points to a specific reason: resource constraints. South Korea basically hits its practical limit for onshore wind power installations very early, by 2025, mainly due to high population density and just not much available land. Because they couldn't build out more wind and they couldn't import power from neighbors in this model, they had to rely much more heavily on solar PV and the associated battery storage later on, which, while getting cheaper, was still a slightly higher cost path given their specific limitations.
So that energy island rule really bites countries with fewer domestic resource options. It really underscores the potential benefits of interconnection, which we might come back to. Before we wrap up, the speed of this change is just incredible. What does this mean for decarbonization?
The pace is remarkable. The study shows absolute CO2 equivalent emissions plummeting. They drop by 90% by 2030 compared to 2015 levels, from over 4,000 megatons down to around 450 megatons.
90% by 2030. That's less than a decade from now. It's stunningly fast.
It really is. And by 2045, the system is virtually decarbonized. Emissions are down 99%. It's a near total transformation of the power sector's climate impact in under 30 years. And connecting this to the broader economy, this power sector transition isn't happening in a vacuum. The study sees it as the absolute cornerstone for decarbonizing everything else.
Right, electricity becomes the central player.
Exactly. It becomes the main integrating energy platform. Think about it. Clean electricity will charge the electric vehicles that replace gasoline cars. It will power heat pumps for buildings. It will run cleaner industrial processes. And for sectors that are really hard to electrify directly, like aviation or shipping, that clean electricity will be used to produce green hydrogen or synthetic fuels. The power sector enables decarbonization everywhere else.
It really becomes the backbone of the entire net zero economy. What about the investment flow? You mentioned it's front-loaded.
Yes, the biggest push in spending happens in the 2020s. That's when you need huge investment to start replacing the old fossil fuel plants and build the first big waves of renewables and storage. After that initial surge, the model shows investments stabilizing somewhat, running at about 160 billion euros per year between 2035 and 2045.
And how is that stable investment split? Is it still mostly building new power plants?
Interestingly, by the time you get to that near 100% renewable system, say from 2045 to 2050, the investment splits almost perfectly down the middle. Roughly half goes into primary generation, building more solar, maybe replacing older wind turbines, and the other half goes directly into storage technologies, batteries, power-to-gas facilities. It shows how critical that flexibility becomes. So, wrapping it all up, the core message for you, the listener, is pretty powerful. This transition isn't just about environmental necessity, though it certainly is that. According to this study, moving to 100% renewables is actually the least cost pathway for Northeast Asia's energy future. That projected average LCOE of 55 euros is about 25% cheaper than the fossil fuel-dominated system of 2015.
Lower costs, near zero emissions, energy independence within each nation. It's a compelling vision, backed by detailed modeling. Again, the source is the rising role of PV and wind energy in the power sector and beyond, changing the Northeast Asian power landscape. Definitely worth exploring if you want more detail. But let's end with a thought to chew on. The entire model, as we stressed, treated each country as an energy island. No international power trading allowed. We saw how China benefited massively just from integrating its own diverse internal regions. So imagine this. What if that energy island constraint was removed? What additional economic benefits, what resource sharing efficiencies, maybe even what geopolitical shifts could happen if the power grids across Northeast Asia connecting, say, resource-rich Mongolia with industrial China and land-constrained South Korea were fully integrated? What could that unlock? Something to think about. Join us next time for another deep dive.